Welcome to the Great Language Partner podcast. I'm Katya.
And I'm Nicole. We are two neurodiversity affirming speech therapists on a mission to bring joy to your autistic child's communication journey.
Separately, we've helped hundreds of neurodivergent kids become confident communicators, but we know we can make an even bigger impact together. Whether you're a parent or professional, we're here for you as you navigate your unique journey.
We'll talk all things Gestalt language development, sensory processing, and beyond as we share practical tips and inspiring stories to help you become your child or student's greatest language partner.
Let's create a more understanding, supportive, and affirming world for autistic kids.
One conversation at a time.
Hi, Erin. So happy to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited to be here and chat and learn from one another and share as much info as I can.
Yeah, finding your page, I felt like it was a piece of my brain that I have been really you kind of share about something that's been a special interest for me recently. So I'm really excited to chat with you and learn more from you about supporting motor planning in our autistic kids. Before we dive into that, can you tell our listeners a bit about who you are?
Yeah, definitely. I always like to say I'm first and foremost a human. I like to just remind everyone that we're all human. We're all just on this path figuring it out and learning from one another. So I start with that, but I am also an occupational therapist. I own Sunrise Therapies here in Southern California, and I am a huge advocate and autistic ally in the Apraxic autistic community specifically. So what that means for me is supporting the non-speaking, minimally speaking, or unreliably speaking population. And some of you might be like, what does that even mean? And we could get there. But supporting them from this apraxia lens with the background and knowledge that I have as an OT for sensory processing. And then, I'm a fur mama, a friend, a wife, all those good things. But that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Thanks. When I found your page, it really emphasized something that I have kind of this idea that I formed and I'm going to be sharing in my new course about supporting non-speaking Gestalt processors. But there's three main assumptions that I make when I am supporting a non or minimally speaking autistic child. One is that they are likely a Gestalt language processor, which is what this whole podcast is about. But two is that they are probably experiencing some kind of motor planning challenges, apraxia of speech, dyspraxia. Sometimes it's the whole body, sometimes it's just the speech, but they're likely experiencing that because many autistic people do, especially non-speaking autistic people. And then the third thing is that they are competent. Those are the three kind of assumptions that I lean off of. They're not always true for every autistic, minimally speaking person, but it doesn't hurt to assume those things and kind of base your practice off of them. But I felt like your page really emphasized those last two ideas of apraxia, dyspraxia is a huge piece of the puzzle. And also because of that, we have to presume competence. So I'm really excited to dive into what all that means. We've chatted a bit about apraxia, dyspraxia on the show, but maybe we can start with just talking about what that is and why it's so important to understand what that is when we're supporting autistic kids.
Yeah, definitely. I love those 3 points for sure. And I think they're becoming more and more known. So the more that this podcast could reach more people, the better. For apraxia, I always explain it as you may hear the term apraxia or apraxia or dyspraxia, right? So really all that means is A is without praxis, like that it's not there at all. And dys is that there's some difference or dysfunction in the medical terms. We know a lot about apraxia, acquired apraxia, I label it as, right? Through like things like traumatic brain injury or stroke for individuals that once had praxis and then lost it. But relating it to this community is something that is really hard for people to do. So let me break down even further. Praxis means motor planning. So really all that means is taking the information in our mind, like, hey, I'm thirsty. I want to pick up my water bottle. So I need to reach my hand out, close my fingers around it, bend my elbow, bring it to my mouth, wrap my lips around it, and then suck and swallow, right? So there's so many micro steps of one big motor action. And what we're learning more and more about and really seeing in my practice is that non-speaking, minimally speaking, and unreliably speaking autistic individuals, their challenges are mostly in this area, more so than in the cognitive area that we have thought for a really long time. And that society as a whole has known or thought, right? And even what schools are still teaching. There's so many people out there still with this. For me, I say still, right? This might be new information for some listeners, but for me, it's like, oh my gosh, how are we still not seeing that this is like a huge proponent of what is happening for these individuals? So with that apraxia or dyspraxia piece, it's really just an inconsistency or a breakdown of the ability to execute those motor plans. So a lot of times you hear childhood apraxia of speech, and I learned that phrase and the diagnosis from a lot of my speechy friends. And when I first started, I was like, yeah, that makes so much sense, right? Like I'm looking at the sensory piece. They have apraxia of the mouth, right? That's why they can't speak. They're at that point as a new grad, I thought there was still some cognitive piece to it, that they receptively weren't understanding us as well. But when I hear the diagnosis autism and I hear that they are quote unquote nonverbal, right? My brain 99% of the time goes straight to that this is a motor disorder, not a cognitive disorder. And probably 99.9%, right? I always prefer to presume up, right? Like you're saying, presume competence, because there's so much more harm in presuming down and assuming that just because they can't show us with their motor output that they understand, that they don't, right? So I could go on a whole tangent on that, but that's a snippet of what that term means. Do you have any questions before I dive a little deeper into it?
I mean, I understand it pretty well because it's definitely an interest of mine. But I think that was a great explanation for everyone who might not have any awareness. But yeah, I describe apraxia or dyspraxia as a brain to body disconnect. So like you said, it's so often misunderstood that these non-speaking kids or just autistic kids in general are non-compliant or not understanding or stubborn or not motivated to communicate or act when given commands. But so often it's just this brain-body disconnect. They know what they want to do, but they can't get their body to do it because of that dyspraxia. Yeah, and that's why it's so important that we know that might be going on, so we can assume that the child might actually really be comprehending, but they just can't quite get themselves to do what they are maybe really wanting to do in that moment. And yeah, like you said, it doesn't hurt to presume competence. It doesn't hurt to presume that they're actually understanding maybe a whole lot more than they can tell us. And it also doesn't hurt to presume that there might be motor disabilities happening, or AKA apraxia or dyspraxia. And I think it can be a tricky thing when it comes to speech, because we're taught, based on the research, that only about 2% of kids have apraxia of speech. But I think that is very misleading, because so many autistic kids don't get an apraxia of speech diagnosis because they can't go through the really rigid testing that is required to actually give that diagnosis. I've literally never been able to get one of my autistic clients to go through the testing enough that I can actually legally give them a diagnosis of CAS or childhood apraxia of speech, but I give a suspected apraxia of speech diagnosis to so many kids. And so I think it's way more common in the autistic community than the research shows. And there are some studies that show really high numbers, like 2/3 of autistic people. So I think that is probably a lot more accurate, but we do need more research on the speech aspect of it. But I often say that autism is a motor disorder, and it really does go hand in hand in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something to highlight there is this term, diagnostic overshadowing, right? So when someone gets an autism diagnosis, that's all you hear or see or think about, right? It's autism. Especially as a parent, it's like, whoa, it's this big, heavy experience for parents oftentimes. But when we look at what is part of autism, right? We think, okay, communication challenges, sensory processing, regulation challenges, right? And then we have all the ones that I don't necessarily always agree with, right? Like the social challenges or, in their own world, all those kind of things. And praxis is part of that, right? Like as OTs, we learn that praxis difficulties are part of the autism diagnosis, but it is overshadowed by sensory processing, which is a part of praxis, right? But it's overshadowed by communication difficulties, intellectual difficulties. Like as an OT, I was trained to look at all of that, right? And like meet them at wherever they test developmentally. Whereas all of these tests that we provide, like you're saying, require motor output. So like literally everything we do as humans. I always say that apraxia does not discriminate a lot of times. When I think of childhood apraxia of speech, and I'd be curious about your perspective on this, here I go down a rabbit hole, but when I hear childhood apraxia of speech, I almost picture the kids that have solely that diagnosis, that like have that, maybe some sensory processing differences, right? When I think of non-speaking autism, I think of full body praxis and that it doesn't discriminate. Like I find it kind of rare, again, in my practice, no formal research, but that if there is an autism diagnosis and I am seeing non-speaking, minimally speaking, or unreliably speaking kind of tendencies, I'm never like, oh, it's just childhood apraxia of the mouth. It's like, it's the eyes, it's the big muscles, it's the breathing muscles. It is literally every muscle. So I don't know your perspective on that, but let me just wrap up my thought and then I would love to hear yours about the testing, right? So every test we do, it's point to this, look to this, say this, all of that. Our eye muscles have to move. We have to reach our hand and point. We have to coordinate our breathing, our mouth, our tongue, our lips, all of that to say the command, right? And then you add in all the other aspects that I think we'll get to. And it's like, how are we saying that these individuals are at a quote unquote cognitive level of X or developmental level of X when they have literally we are not setting them up for success in showing their skills to us through motor output, essentially. So that's my soapbox.
Yes. Standardized testing is hard for these kids for so many reasons, but that is a huge one. I was just talking with a parent, giving them some IEP coaching this morning, and they were saying, it's so disappointing because they know their child knows their letters, can identify all the letters and numbers. This child's 4, but on their IEP, they were reading through it and it says that they have none of those skills. And I'm like, yeah, they are non-speaking. They're probably experiencing dyspraxia throughout their body, which means maybe in that moment they couldn't point to the letter that the teacher was reading. But with you've seen it other times when they're regulated and their body's allowing them to do that thing, because dyspraxia, motor planning stuff, that's kind of the hallmark of it, right? Is that it's really random. Sometimes we can do this thing on command and sometimes we can't. Sometimes I can say this word and sometimes I totally can't. And that's, I think, why a lot of kids get labeled as stubborn, because it's like, I know they can do this thing. They've done it before, but it's not that easy. But yeah, Standardized
Yeah.
testing can be really hard to get an accurate picture of what these kids know and can do when dyspraxia is maybe there. Yeah, I forget what your other
That's okay.
point was.
The concept of childhood apraxia speech, and like, do you feel that you've ever seen an autistic individual that solely has like just mouth apraxia, or is it kind of generalized?
No, I've never worked with a minimally speaking kid that didn't also have, motor coordination issues, couldn't ride a bike, walked kind of strangely, whatever it may be. Maybe you can talk more about how dyspraxia shows up in the body, but they almost always go hand in hand. Now, I have seen non-autistic kids with apraxia of speech who seem like it's more just their speech, but oftentimes it still does show up in their whole body, I would say.
Yeah.
But I don't typically work with those kids, so.
Yeah, I know. I like have to think back to like clinical rotations, and there were a few kids that were like in the school system only getting speech, and I knew of them. But yeah, it's so interesting how I want to say the outside world, but it's not. It's like how researchers look at things in such like isolated ways, and we need that. And I like to say it's also like research takes so long, and it's so systematized and standardized, and it's like nothing is a better teacher than being in it and working in it and learning from the individuals, right? Like, and it's so hard sometimes when you're speaking to someone, which I am pretty like clinically, and I love research. Like I am focused on all of that. And I understand sometimes that I don't need a full research paper to really believe what's happening, because I see it happening right in front of my eyes, and I'm going to approach it this way because I see it working, right? So, what was my point of saying that? Oh, it's just so interesting how, when I talk to someone like you, it's like, oh, you get it, right? And the conversation flows. And then there's other times where you really do need to break it down. And that's kind of something that you brought up of like, what does it even look like? How does it manifest in the body? Are you cool if I go there now?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, when I look for apraxia in the whole body, it often looks like, well, let me go through some of the steps of motor planning, which I touched on a little bit earlier when I was introducing like the terminology. But when we look at motor planning, the first step is ideation, right? So we're thinking about the motor plan, and we're thinking about what it is I even need to solve this issue that I'm having, or this desire that I'm having, right? So let's go. I went to like my water bottle before, but let's say I want to pick up my phone to text someone, right? So I have the idea. I realize in order to text someone, I need my phone. Okay, now I need to figure out, where is my phone? Oh, it's just a little bit to the right on my little laptop stand, right? So then I have to get my eyes to coordinate down to it. I'm not going to go through every little step. I'm going to do that for the beginning, just so you realize how much work it is for these individuals. So then my eyes are there. Then they need to sustain the gaze on it so I could reach my hand and accurately, like with depth perception and the modulation of force, grab my phone, right? So these are all things that we don't think about like in the conscious mind, but these are all tiny steps of it. So that's the ideation and the sequencing, I should say, right? Like I know this comes first, this comes second, third, blah, blah, blah. Where it turns from all like cognitive and in my mind to motor output is on execution. And this is where I really focus a lot of my like observation and my clinical work. Execution requires three main steps. And I call it, well, it is called cognitive motor control. So it's how are we cognitively in our mind controlling our motor output, our movements. So first is the initiation. I need to get the message from my mind to my muscle. I need to fire that neuron. It gets there, great. I initiated it. Now I need to sustain that firing so my arm keeps reaching, right? And then by the time my fingers touch my phone, I now need to inhibit that firing and initiate a new one, right? So we call that transitioning between movements. So now I need to inhibit I'll get real technical if there's any OT or biomechanical people, right? Like I need to inhibit my tricep extension to initiate my bicep flexion, right? So there's all these tiny pieces in that execution piece that the breakdown happens. And then the last step is like feedback and information gathering. And that's where sensory processing comes in to know like, oh, I used too much force, or I visually overshot that, or I went too short. Next time I need to swing the bat this way if I'm playing baseball, right? Like it's taking that feedback and then holding on to it for the next time. And that's where what you had said earlier about like the stubbornness, they get labeled as stubborn when it's like, I know they could do it. They've done it before. Yes, but they did it that one time, but were they able to integrate the feedback of, oh, that worked and I need to do it in that same exact way next time to be able to do it? All that time was their body, like that part of their brain, the motor cortex, was able to hold on to this to then initiate it in the same exact way the next time. So what that looks like, sometimes I call them stalls. Like you might be asking the individual, like, come on, get up, let's go. We got to go to the car. And it's just sitting there, right? Mm. And that looks like noncompliance or stubbornness or whatever, negative label you want to put on it. But if you ask them, hey, bring your shoulders forward, push down into your feet and straighten your knees, or like get your bum off the chair, you break down the motor planning steps for their body, they will most often execute on it. They will move through it. So I always tell individuals like, hey, I'm going to break this down, not because I don't think you like cognitively understand me, not because I don't think your brain understands me, but I'm talking your body right now because I know your body's not listening to you. So I'm going to help you through it. We call it motor coach you through this. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's not as simple. It's not always going to be that if you break it down, it's just going to happen like that, right? Like I wish I had that magic trick for everyone, but I challenge anyone out there that thinks there's stubbornness happening or, non-compliance happening in those moments. Say that exact phrase, like, hey, I see that your body's not listening to you right now. I believe you want to do this or you want to learn how to do it. I believe in you. I'm going to coach your body. I'm going to presume this confidence in you and I'm here with you, right? And that alone shifts regulation and just like self-confidence. And there's so much that even just saying that statement. And then even if you mess up the breakdown of the motor plan, you're like, oh my gosh, that didn't work. There's been times where I'll say like, okay, bring your knee up. And the individual literally just like brings their knee up into their chest. I'm like, okay, I was not coaching your body effectively. Let's start over and try again, right? So like, it's okay to share and be, vulnerable and honest with them that like, hey, I'm figuring this out with you. So yeah, motor coaching in that execution stage for that initiation, sustaining, and inhibiting is huge. And that's like, I think one of the biggest takeaways I could give to anyone listening.
Yeah. I have never heard of motor coaching, and I haven't really had the pleasure of working with any OTs besides the schools where they were really not, working on like handwriting or things that didn't really apply to what I was doing. But I just hired an OT, so I'm excited to see more of that in action. But that talking through the motor plan, I wouldn't have even thought about that. But I love that you mentioned the like shifting your language to just be like, hey, I know you probably want to do this thing, but your body's not letting you. Like that is huge. Also just shifting how we talk to these kids in general, because so many of these individuals are seen as not understanding. So then we talk to them like they're a baby or a child when they're a teenager. And just talking to them like they do understand can shift so much as well.
Talk about polyvagal theory and neuroception, right? Like just changing how we are like energetically approaching them, and our internal thoughts and what we're perceiving about them could then set their nervous system up for safety and regulation to then be starting off in like a strong foundation before we give the challenging thing, right? So it's so important. I could talk for hours about presuming competence and the impact it can have.
Yeah, we've done a few episodes where we touch on neuroception in regards to pathological demand avoidance and that kind of realm. And yeah, just talking about signaling safety by, being your true self, not pretending, treating the child like they're competent. And yeah, that's a whole nother conversation.
Totally.
But I love this, I was going to ask you, what are some supports that we can use to help kids who are experiencing dyspraxia, experiencing it beyond just with speech. So that sounds like that's a big one, doing this kind of outward motor coaching. Are there any other things to consider, or is it like too deep to get into? Obviously, an occupational therapist can help you with these things, but
yeah, I mean, as a parent, I would say being sure that whoever is on the team knows what apraxia is, really like starting there and knowing that it is connected to this community, because someone can know what apraxia is and they're thinking of those diagnoses I mentioned earlier, right? Like neuro rehab, stroke, TBI, things like that. So really like asking those questions, because like I said, when I was a new grad, I did not know any of this, and I did not approach, I was an OT, I was a licensed OT, and I didn't approach therapy this way. And I'm still going through like my grief and healing journey of being like, oh my gosh, all those individuals that I served that I didn't presume competence, or I thought they were non-compliant because I didn't connect something that I knew really deeply. It just was like in the other part of my OT brain for if I ever went to that setting, right? So that would be the first thing. Motor coaching is huge. Presuming competence and speaking at an age-appropriate level is huge. And then I would say embracing like a resiliency and growth mindset. That's something really big in like my own personal work and in my like professional work of 90, I mean, this isn't an accurate number, but I want to say like 95% of the individuals that I serve, I've asked them, I've checked in when their body is like spiking in dysregulation in these, where like if we were doing like fully child-led therapy, it would be like, oh no, we're done. Like we're moving on, right? Like let's ex-nay this. I will check in with them with a reliable form of communication, and they will say, no, let's keep going. I want to push through this, right? So the resiliency and the drive for growth and learning is so there. And obviously I'm not saying like jump in and just like grind, right? But like build the connection, build trust, build rapport, really tune into, and this is where it probably gets a little too deep to touch on a podcast, but I'm happy to talk with anyone about this. I have a course specifically for OTs on this, but tuning into those body cues and what we know about arousal levels and sensory motor, processing and execution, and take that information and then decide, am I going forward or am I stepping back? But again, 99% of the time it is hey, like let's try this. And with littles, it's a little different. So something I didn't share about myself is that a lot of the individuals I serve are like 16 and up. My oldest is like 50 something, which if you spoke to me again as that new grad, I was like, give me all the little, So it's interesting how it's evolved, but I do serve some littles too. And I approach it with the same competence and motor coaching mindset, but littles' bodies just have a lot more energy, and the arousal level is usually a lot higher, and that's okay, right? But understanding that when their body's buzzing around like a therapy gym or your house or the park, know that like their body might be going, more than likely is going to things impulsively, right? Everything that we see on the outside is not necessarily what they're thinking on the outside. And that's kind of this like double side of this motor planning or of apraxia, that sometimes they can't get their body to do what they want to do, but then they also can't stop their body from doing what they don't want to be doing. And that's where that impulsive, those impulsive patterns come in, and narrating for them like, hey, I'm not sure if your body wants to be doing that, so I'm going to try to coach you this way. Right? But if you want to keep doing that, keep doing it. That's totally cool. I'll come join you. Right? And again, just that phrase alone could be so reaffirming of like, oh my gosh, you get that I don't want to be doing this? Like, thank you. Help me get out of it. So yeah, I don't know if that was clear cut, but those are my main areas.
So when autistic kids or adults or adolescents get stuck in these kind of loops. Like they are saying the same word over and over, or they're doing this thing over and over. Is that related to dyspraxia as well, or this kind of starting and stopping of movements? I downloaded one of your freebies called 4 Steps of Motor Planning and Cognitive Motor Control, and there was one piece in there that like is still blowing my mind. And you mentioned about autistic brains and the myelination challenges and this can sometimes make these repetitive behaviors happen. I would love to chat about that because I have never heard that idea in my life. So it was a big aha moment for me.
Yeah, definitely. So what I refer to as motor loops are anything that is happening over and over in a repetitive way, right? So some of you out there might be thinking, well, what about a self-stim? Mm-hmm. It is, right? It's a loop that's happening over and over. It fires, it feels good, I get feedback from it, it feels good, I do it again, right? Like it's soothing to my nervous system and I keep going. I always relate this to neurotypical people as like scrolling on Instagram. Like I'm like, I know I probably shouldn't be doing this, but I can't stop. And I'm going to sit here and it takes a lot of work to stop it, right? So what happens, or when I'm looking at motor loops, I really think about, is this regulating? Is this calming the body, right? And again, if they don't have a reliable form of communication yet, we have to use our best judgment and tune into all those areas I was talking about. But if they do have a reliable form of communication, I always check in, right? So I have an individual that we've been working on like deep breaths for a really long time. And every time he exhales, it's a, right, a blow out the hand. And it's, hey, do you want to be doing this? Like, because it's not affecting anyone. Is it helping you like with the motor plan of breathing? Then we'll keep it. But if you're wanting to do like a more controlled, relaxed deep breath of like, then let's work on that, right? So then we get feedback from the individuals of, I do want to change it, or I don't, leave me alone. I just want to do this, right? So I want to kind of explain what I mean about the myelin, right? So when we practice something over and over, it becomes an automatic motor plan. And for us, that could be driving the same route to work. It could be riding a bike, right? It's like riding a bike. You never forget. It's automatic. And that's good. We create those pathways because they help us. They make the cognitive load of us having to think about all the motor planning steps, it makes it automatic. So I could just do it, right? I could drive and I could listen to a podcast. However, and the way it becomes automatic is it becomes more myelinated. It's just this fatty substance that is all along the axon of the neuron. I think it's an axon. I'm like going back to school right now, but it's along the long part of the neuron, and it makes it fire quicker, right? Because it's fatty, it's insulated. However, if it becomes really over-myelinated, then it becomes impulsive or a stuck loop. It becomes really hard to make it not automatic. And this is where we actually see dysregulation come because they can't stop it, right? So it looks like a self-stim of like bopping my thighs with my fists. I'm just thinking of some of the individuals I work with. And it's like, I started that because it felt good. It gave me proprioceptive input to my body to feel my body in space, but now I can't stop it and it's hurting my body. Like, someone help me stop this. And that's again where the motor coaching comes in, where it's like, hey, like, try to relax your muscles, reach your hands here, let me squeeze your hands, roll this on your legs instead. And I will say that these motor loops are very, very challenging to inhibit and then initiate a new one, as you would imagine, because they're so strong. Whereas it's a little bit easier to practice this inhibition through motor plans that aren't automatic or stuck loops yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
I think sometimes I struggle with knowing if repetitive thing is something that I should interrupt, that the child or person might want assistance in interrupting, or, you know, if they're enjoying it and I should just let it be. I also see this a lot with like kids wanting me to repeat their gestalt 10 times in a row, and if I don't, they get really upset, but I don't know that that relates at all, or if that's more of a kind of OCD thing or a control thing. I think there's sometimes, depending on the child, it could be a different reason, but yeah, sometimes it's hard to know exactly how to react. But I think, like you said, just maybe giving them that option of the motor coaching, like, if you want to stop this, here's a thing you could do, or if you want to try something different, here's an option. And if they engage with that, then they do, and then we know.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes back to me introducing myself as a human, right? Like, we're all human, we're all figuring out. No one knows for sure except that individual, and that's where that reliable form of communication really, like, is the game changer for it. But if you're not there that's okay. It's, you know, it's really just offering the options and motor coaching within it, right? Instead of just like, if their body's jumping on the trampoline nonstop, or let's use the example of like repeating a gestalt, right? Like repeating it over and over. You could say like, this might be a loop for you and it feels dysregulating if I don't close it. Let's try singing this instead, right? And then you say like, bring your tongue to the top of your mouth. I am not good at motor coaching the mouth. That is your expertise. But, you know, it's like coaching them to move through it instead of saying, let's sing this instead to get you unstuck. You break it down of like, you know, make your mouth look like this and then say, oh, whatever the sound you're trying to sing, right? And then just see. And always explaining, like, it looks like your body might be stuck right now, and that's okay. You know, I'm here for it, and I'm here to support you in it. If it's more helpful for me to close the loop for you right now, I will keep repeating this back to you, and that's fine. And there might be days where you just got to do that, and it's because the nervous system is just fried, right? They had a really long day the day before, they didn't sleep, or they have gut issues. You know, there's so much that could be a part of it. But I always say, just explore it. And if it becomes too much, go right back to what you're doing, and that's okay. So yeah, I would say those motor loops, again, it doesn't discriminate. It's the voice, it's the eyes, it's the whole body.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting. And I'm definitely thinking about quite a few kids. And I would love to, I'm excited to have an OT on my team to do more of this multi-layered support, because that's an idea that we constantly come back to with everyone that we have talked to on the podcast, is that supporting autistic kids has so many layers, and it really does take a whole team and so many different brains to really figure out what's going on, and how can we support these kids best, because there's often so many different pieces to consider, and they all kind of overlap. This dyspraxia piece really overlaps with the speech, which is another whole thing that I could talk about, and that we didn't get into a whole lot, but that's something that I've been really trying to learn more about now that I have an OT to help support that. Like, if my child is non-speaking, instead of starting with words, I should probably be starting with like posture and core support, and just like producing any kind of sound in general, and making sure they have the strength and like body coordination for that, and just learning that piece. I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I don't really know how to do that as a speech therapist, but at least I know, like, okay, I can get someone, an occupational therapist, to give some insight into that. But yeah, if listeners are interested in that, Marge Blanc has a dyspraxia hierarchy of supports. She details this in her When Speech Gets Stuck article, and it it kind of combines the dyspraxia and the apraxia of speech, or the dyspraxia and, suspected maybe apraxia of speech, but it really shows how we have to start at the body before we're thinking even about the speech for so many of these kids. And sometimes they've already got the body stuff down, but starting there doesn't hurt. And it's pretty fascinating. Yeah. But we really, OTs and speech therapists really have to work as a team, especially for this particular population.
Yeah, it's amazing what, like, just discussing and sharing clinical experience and backgrounds, and then taking, like I've been saying this whole time, right? Like taking feedback from the individuals, and feedback doesn't always need to be spoken language or AAC language, right? It could be body language. It could be how their nervous system responded to an activity, right? Like always taking that feedback that you get from the individuals you're serving, and then coming back to the drawing board as clinicians and with parents and saying, well, this is what we're seeing. Let's try this, But I also want to highlight that, the full body prior to the fine motor. Like I look at speech, ocular motor, and like fine motor as all fine motor. And when I say fine motor, if you're just listening, I waved my fingertips, right? So that is all fine motor. Whereas anything, honestly, for this community, even like elbows and shoulders is refined. It's like trunk and hips maybe is gross motor. Mm-hmm. And then like ankle, elbow, knees, fingers, eyes, mouth is all fine motor. And how does, the diaphragm and posture and stability and vestibular, like it's just so much. So I feel like we could definitely talk for hours about how it's all intertwined.
Yeah, but speech is the most intricate fine motor piece. So yeah, absolutely. You're saying that the gross motor stuff has to come before that?
It's interesting because for the longest time I would say like it had to come before, but I don't know if I love that because it kind of goes into that, like we have to check off these boxes before we could move on to the next goal. So I like to say that like we have to focus our attention there while, like, if we're going to be thinking about these other fine motor things, right? Like to come in and just look at these refined motor planning processes, we're missing a huge piece. So I think it just needs to be meshed together. I don't think it's like someone needs to have perfect core stability and, and have write their name so perfectly in a 2-inch line before we can work on speech or more refined things. It's just always have it in the back of your mind.
Got it.
So, yeah.
Okay, as we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to share? If not, I know people are going to want to learn more from you, so if you can share where they can find you and anything that you have to offer. I know you mentioned a course.
Yeah. Like I said, I could talk for hours and hours on this in a lot of tangents and like in an unorganized way. So it's probably better that like we connect in an organized way. And that's why I made the course, because I was like, I have all these ideas in my mind I want to share with everyone, but like, let me synthesize this in an organized way. So I do have a course specifically for occupational therapists right now. I look at it from a very like growth and resiliency mindset for yourself as an individual, like outside of your role or your occupation as a therapist. So we do some mindset work on either end, and then the middle chunks are all clinically related, giving some deeper information about apraxia and then what to do with the information essentially. And then I have a parent course coming out as well, specifically for the non-speaking autistic community. You can find all that at otlevelup.com. And then I'm on social. It's at sunrise.therapies, plural. And those are probably the two best ways to find me. I am happy to like answer DMs or correspond through email. This is my like meat and potatoes. I love talking about this, and a big life goal of mine is just to get more and more people to understand it from this perspective, and even just take one little nugget and try it and presume that competence that these individuals really deserve and have really not gotten in way too long. So
amazing. And you're located in San Diego, right? So if people wanted to maybe work with you directly, you do provide services in San Diego?
Yes. Yeah, good point. So we are a mobile OT practice in San Diego and in Long Beach. So we do not have a clinic space. I've worked in clinic spaces and they're amazing and I miss it sometimes, but we are in the homes or out in the community, on the mountains, in the ocean, at Target, wherever these skills need to be practiced. So yeah, we would love to connect if you're looking for services as well. We're strictly OT though. So we have great providers here as well, speech, music therapy, PT that we refer to and collaborate with. We just, under the Sunrise umbrella, is just OT.
Awesome. Well, if I make my way out there, because I'm considering moving to Southern California in the next year or so, I will be excited to connect.
Yeah, definitely.
Last question for you. We always ask for a book recommendation. If you have anything that's informed your practice or just your views about supporting autistic people, I would love to hear.
How much time do we have? It's funny because I was like, let me actually take out the book. So I am a big book nerd and all self-development, clinical learning. I cannot get into any of the other books that are out there right now. So I have 3 books. I'm sorry you asked for one, but I have 3. This one is great. It's called Autism, the Movement Sensing Perspective, by Caroline Wyatt and Elizabeth Torres. Elizabeth Torres has done extensive amount of research in the motor planning and sensory motor perspective. So this is more of a clinical learning book. It's dense and it's going to take you a while to get through, but it's got amazing information in it. My second is I Am Intelligent by Peyton Goddard and her mother, Diane. This is another amazing, written by a non-speaking autistic woman and her experience of not being presumed competent. So that's learning and storytelling. And then last up, this is nothing to do, well, I guess everything has to do with the autistic community when you serve that community, but this one is a self-development book, and it's called The Mastery of Life by Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. And it is just a nice one to pick up and randomly read a page or 2 in the morning with coffee. It's so good. So there you go. I'm not sponsored by any, but I love them.
Awesome. You hit all the markers. Yeah. So whatever you're looking for.
Exactly.
And I've never heard of any of those. So I'm constantly adding to my list now. I need to actually start reading so I can get through some of these. But the I Am Intelligent book, I read Ito in Autism Land, which is a book from a non-speaker that really shares his perspective of not being presumed competent and feeling kind of trapped in his body due to dyspraxia and apraxia of speech. And that was a huge shift for me after reading that. I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to change what I'm doing here. And it's listening to stories from autistic people, especially autistic people who are so underrepresented because, we hear from a lot of speaking autistics, but it's harder to hear from our non-speaking autistics. So it's so valuable. I'll have to check that one out too. Thank you so much, Erin. It's been really fun to have you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. Let me know when you're down in SoCal and we'll definitely hang out and chat.
Okay, I will.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
I love to wake up